breakdown. I'm Max Ralph. That's Johnny McGonigal here from Penn Live. Another Thursday live session for y'all Penn State fans where we're still breaking down some transfer portal movement. But today we really want to get into some talk about the Penn State coaching staff. Matt Campbell's first assistant tree at Penn State for 2026 is pretty much finalized with the addition officially of running backs coach Savon Huggins this week on Tuesday. So his staff, every position coach is in place. We're going to talk a little bit about, some of the hires we find really interesting, some of the guys we want to learn more about. We've talked about them at different points kind of on their own, but now we have a chance to talk about it on a whole. So we'll do that. Johnny, I feel like we got to start too. You were covering the Eagles last weekend, obviously kind of a brutal loss there. And boy, the news cycle has been pretty brutal for the Eagles this week as well. Obviously, Penn State podcast, but for you, the Eagles fired Kevin Patullo, and also for the Penn State angle, you talked to Jan Dodson, and he's one of the ones who seems like he's probably on his way out of Philly. So just a lot going on for you in Eagles world right now as well.
A lot going on, Max. As one coaching staff finalizes and comes together, another is not falling apart necessarily, but Kevin Patullo removed as offensive coordinator for the Eagles. The Eagles also could have other assistant coaches, some on the defensive side of the ball, potentially poached as defensive coordinators elsewhere. A lot of players will be moving on after this Eagles season and after the Steelers season that you guys had as well. A lot happening there with Mike Tomlin, and there's just a lot going on, a lot of movement in the NFL for teams that are eliminated, both teams in state here. You mentioned Jan Dodson, had a really good conversation with him during locker clear-out day. The former Penn State star wide receiver, spent 2 years with the Eagles, won a Super Bowl last year, had a big catch in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs, was always the wide receiver number 3, behind A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith. His contract is up. The Eagles didn't take his 5th-year option on his rookie deal last April. So he kind of went throughout this year knowing, or at least figuring, that this would be his last season in Philly. But he's excited for, he was sad on Monday, obviously leaving the teammates behind, but also excited and motivated to land in a new spot in the NFL and have more of a role because he was very much a maybe gets a target or two a game kind of guy over the last 2 years for the Eagles, and did well with the opportunities that he was given and showcased why he was such a talent at Penn State. But very much looking forward to seeing where he lands. And, again, really good conversation. So there was a story up on Penn Live. I think it's both on our Eagles and Penn State pages. Find them on either of those. And yeah, Jahan's always great. Jahan's one of the really good guys to deal with, and pulling for him to land in a good spot.
Yeah, Jahan's such an interesting one because, I mean, to your point there, he was always just such a class act at Penn State as well. Great to interact with. A great quote, like always great to work with from a media perspective, but also like immense talent. He was a fantastic player, one of the better wide receivers in Penn State history. Set a few records, and he goes to the NFL as a first round pick. And his rookie season and even his second season were pretty strong. And then kind of out of nowhere in his third season, he's buried in the depth chart in Washington and gets the trade. And he never really recaptures what that rookie second season ceiling looked like for him with the Eagles. Of course, he won a Super Bowl, which I don't think anybody's going to complain about. But for a guy who we know is very, very talented, have seen up close for a long time. And just like you said, an overall good guy. Certainly interested in what happens to him in the NFL this offseason. You talked about the coaching carousel. Like, I didn't think it could get crazier than last offseason or 2 off seasons ago when Bill Belichick and Nick Saban both retired in the same offseason, and Pete Carroll retired. Obviously, he's back now, or was back because he got fired too. But like, I didn't think it'd get crazier. And then we got to this offseason where there are now 9 NFL openings, including Mike Tomlin and John Harbaugh, and James Franklin gets fired. Like, there are just Lane Kiffin moves. It's getting absurd in the football space. I don't even know how to wrap my head around all of it.
Dude, I mean, between James Franklin and, so obviously James Franklin with the Penn State beat, Mike Tomlin with our Steelers beat, and Nick Faraball, who does a great job there. the defending Super Bowl champs crashing out in the first round of the playoffs, firing their offensive coordinator. So that's been busy. It has been a very interesting, few months here at football in Pennsylvania, and I mean, honestly, too, what could be another wrinkle, and I wrote a column on this for this morning on our Eagles page, is who I think could be a perfect fit as the coordinator of the Eagles is a guy who was almost a desperation move
Yeah.
for Penn State just a couple months ago or a month ago or so is Brian Dable.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't be surprised at all if Brian Dable, the former New York Giants head coach and Western New York native, along with Nick Sirianni, could reunite with Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley. They were together in New York for a hot minute. So wouldn't be surprised if Brian Dable one time break glass in case of emergency Penn State head coach when everything with Kalani Sitake and all of that went down. Wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in Philly.
Yeah, that would be quite the full circle moment for you, Johnny, as a Penn State and Philly beat reporter. But you're right, just a crazy year in Pennsylvania football. It's really unbelievable when you sit back and just kind of look at all of it. I mean, Mike Tomlin too, like 19
Yeah.
years. If you're not following Nick Farabaugh and all of our Steelers coverage at Penn Live, you can hear a lot more of it over there. They have a podcast and churning out stories all the time. But just like wow, 19 years and the guy's gone. So yeah, let's move on to the Penn State stuff though. Also, actually, I do have to say, Johnny, I think I saw somewhere that today is National Hat Day, so we're both celebrating as we do most days and certainly every week on the podcast. So if you're wearing a hat, shout out right now. But this is a live edition of the Blue White Breakdown. We're going to talk some Penn State transfer movement and the coaching staff. If you have any questions or comments, lay them on us, and we'll try to get to them. Just one bit of breaking news before we get to the coaching staff, and I say breaking because it happened yesterday, but the long expected move of Ethan Grunkemeyer going to Virginia Tech is now official. He committed, signed, announced it himself. Johnny, there's no surprise there. I mean, maybe you could have seen him going to another Power Four that needed a quarterback, but he knows Danny O'Brien, he knows James Franklin, he likes the infrastructure that they have there. Virginia Tech needed a quarterback. When Penn State brought in Rocco Becht, the dominoes kind of fell, and we saw this coming, but now it's official. And just wanted to get your reaction a little bit on that finally becoming a real thing.
Yeah, not necessarily surprised given that James Franklin, Danny O'Brien, these are the guys who recruited Ethan Grunkemeyer, and helped develop him, at Penn State. I still go back to like when it was a will he, won't he enter the portal, right around the Pinstripe Bowl. I thought he might go to Cincinnati just because the fit felt right with them losing Brendan Sorsby, him being an Ohio native, go somewhere where he'll start right away. And I mean, he will start for Virginia Tech, and they desperately needed a quarterback. I didn't know if he would kind of look at the guy who he was backing up for 2 years and Drew Aller and say, I don't know. I don't know about the development there and what James Franklin, Danny O'Brien did with Drew and did not do with Drew ultimately. But turns out that wasn't a turnoff. He's going to Blacksburg. Again, don't blame him. You're not surprised. And Ethan's a great kid. Like talk about Jahan being a great guy to deal with over the years. And Ethan was great after the Pinstripe Bowl. He was great. As you and Bob were always on the road, this past
Mhm.
season with Penn State, dealing with him and, watching him grow as a leader, on and off the field. And, he's someone you wish the best for. So, again, not surprised at all with him going to Virginia Tech. And, yeah, I mean, again, they needed a quarterback down there, like desperately. And that was one of their biggest issues in recent years. So, curious and intrigued to see if that upward trajectory he ended his Penn State career on continues at Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I don't think it's lost on anybody the point that you made about Drew Aller maybe not reaching his full potential at Penn State under the same coaching staff, and also the fact that the improvement that we saw from Ethan Grunkemeyer continued throughout the entire time when James Franklin was not the head coach. Obviously, Danny was still there. Danny O'Brien was still there as the quarterback's coach. But how many times do we also hear Terry Smith say, well, we made the calls to throw the ball down the field and yada yada. Like there was a lot that went on at Penn State that led to Ethan Grunckemeyer's development and improvement to be a starting quarterback that happened without James Franklin. So following him, again, not necessarily a surprise. The relationship was there. And I mean, the same goes for all the former Penn State guys who have committed to James Franklin. Like, we know he is a relationship driven, like, really close with families of athletes and everything. And so all those guys following him is not a surprise. But for Grunkemeyer, you could have made an argument that he might have been better off elsewhere. The only other layer of it that I'm like, not shocked by in any way, but I just think is really intriguing, is that before Grunkemeyer actually committed and made his announcement official, Virginia Tech brought in Bryce Baker as a transfer from North Carolina, who was a four-star, like I want to say top 10, top 15 quarterback in the 2025 class. This is a kid that Penn State tried pretty desperately to flip out of high school from North Carolina after Mac Brown got retired and Bill Belichick took over. Baker ends up staying with the Tar Heels, enters the portal this offseason. James Franklin kind of rekindles that relationship. And so I don't think the expectation is that Baker is going to start over Ethan Grunkemeyer, or necessarily that there will even be a big competition there. But I do think that for outsiders looking in, there was a moment where you say, "Oh my, wait, they just signed Bryce Baker. Like, what happened to Ethan Grunkemeyer? I thought he was our starter." So some depth there, and James Franklin finally gets a guy he wanted for a long time at Penn State. But just interesting. I think it makes sense. The book is officially closed now on Ethan Grunkemeyer, and Penn State will turn to the future with Rocco Becht and company.
Yeah, and he's, like you mentioned, he's one of many who have followed James Franklin to Virginia Tech. Interesting in that, like, a lot of the guys, I tried pulling up the list in another tab, and then my computer started spazzing out on me. The Wi-Fi is not great right now. I really hope this audio holds up, man. And video. So far, good. Okay, good. All right. So I'm not going to tempt fate and try to pull up the list, but from following along as it's happened, it's been a lot of young guys who have followed James Franklin to Virginia Tech, and a lot of those developmental pieces, whether they're freshmen, redshirt freshmen, guys who just recently committed, in the last year or so to Penn State, and so that makes sense because they just pledged to James Franklin like 12 to 18 to 24 months ago, and it's like, well, like, I still believe in his vision, I still believe in his staff, a lot of which is going to Blacksburg with him. So again, that makes sense. It makes sense that some of the older veterans might go elsewhere. And so, yeah, very intrigued. Like, Ethan's the one where he's a quarterback, and it's very easy to follow a development of a quarterback and a rise or fall of a quarterback. And so that's going to be a point that I'm going to be making sure I'm watching Virginia Tech games next year, because out of just sheer curiosity for how James Franklin does, but more specifically for how Ethan does.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. There will be a lot of intrigue, and I'm guessing there will be a lot of Penn State fans who are following along closely with what Virginia Tech does next year as well. Johnny, let's move on to the coaching staff, like we promised we'd talk to these folks about. Again, a reminder, this is a live show right now. We're here every Thursday at noon. Questions, comments, concerns, drop them in that chat, and we'll get to them. But the coaching staff, the on-field coaching staff at least, became official this week as running backs coach Savon Huggins was officially announced. He came from Boston College. He was the final position coach that Matt Campbell had not filled yet. Everyone else is in place. And I gotta say, like, on the surface, I think I'm pretty excited to see more from this coaching staff. I think Matt Campbell has brought in a really nice blend of guys who he knew from Iowa State, who showed that they can do it in a Power 4 level, and also brought in some other names that are, a big splash when you talk about D'Anton Lynn at defensive coordinator, or Ikaika Malloy being the defensive line coach. There are a lot of interesting pieces on this staff. But just to start out with Huggins, because he's the most recent one for me, Johnny, he brings an element to the staff that I think for me was a really big question when Matt Campbell was hired, and that's ties to the East Coast, to the region. Obviously, Terry Smith sticking around does a huge favor for Penn State's recruiting efforts, for just that ethos in Pennsylvania and beyond, because of what he's done for the past 15 years at Penn State. But Huggins comes from the East Coast. He played at Rutgers. He coached at Boston College. He's well respected in New Jersey. And those are areas that when Matt Campbell came over, you said, okay, well, he's never recruited here before. Can he do that? And while there are aspects of modern day recruiting where the regional footprint kind of goes out the window because of the NIL and everything, it does still matter. Like it absolutely still matters. And I just think that that's a very prudent hire for Matt Campbell and this staff to add that aspect because I think they needed it. And also, it's a guy who at Boston College, where it's a tough place to win, he had a couple of good running backs that he churned out.
Absolutely. No, when you look at the offensive side of the staff, I mean, Matt Campbell bringing over Taylor Mauser as offensive coordinator, Noah Pauley as wide receivers coach, Ryan Clanton as offensive line coach, Jake Waters is, going to be the quarterbacks coach. To get some more, non-Iowa State flair onto this staff and onto the offensive staff, in particular, I think is a big deal. You mentioned the New Jersey ties with Huggins. Again, that's an area that Penn State has lived in recruiting. Now they haven't recruited some of the best, a couple of really the best programs in New Jersey, as well as they would have liked over the years, and I think as well as fans would have liked over the years. Maybe he improves that. That would be a big bonus. But also just think of the running backs that Penn State has had over the years, a lot from Pennsylvania, but there are a lot of good backs from Jersey too, just more specific to his position. And obviously, between Nick Singleton, Saquon Barkley, even Journey Brown, like the list goes on, Miles Sanders, of running backs from Pennsylvania, and really, a handful of those, Quentin Martin, even from the western side of the state, that Terry Smith will still be very much involved in making sure those guys stay in state. But there's a lot of talent from New Jersey in terms of running backs. And Huggins can be obviously a very big part in getting those guys to Penn State.
Yeah, absolutely. To continue the discussion on the offensive side of the ball, just because we started there, yes, it's mostly his Iowa State staff, Matt Campbell's former Iowa State staff, but you've kept Trace McSorley in an assistant quarterback's role like he was doing before, which I think is very good. You could have seen him going to Virginia Tech very easily because of the relationship that James Franklin had with him. Obviously, most remember Trace McSorley was a James Franklin recruit at Vanderbilt before he came to Penn State. Keeping him is huge just for the aspect of what a letterman brings to players and kind of knowing what this is all about. I am so interested in what Noah Pauley will do at wide receiver. I mean, 100% is probably the number one coach on this staff that I am curious to see more from. And part of that is because Penn State wide receivers, we talked about Jan Dodson at the start of this. Since Jan Dodson, they've been fairly lackluster. I mean, Parker Washington had a nice year. Then he got injured, of course, and is now being very good, playing very well in the NFL. But since those two, especially, it's been just a dearth of talent at wide receiver. And Noah Pauley is not that way. Iowa State has identified and developed a couple of really good players. You talked about them some with you talked to the Houston Texans guys, Jaden Higgins and Jalen Knoll, a month ago, I guess, when he was hired. He also developed Christian Watson from the FCS level, who's now with the Green Bay Packers. I'm very curious to see what he does with a few more resources at Penn State. For me, he is hands down 100% the coach on this staff that I am most curious to see what else he can bring to Penn State.
And that goes hand in hand with wide receiver being probably the position that you are most curious about, aside from quarterback, because that's everything, right? But we know the situation at wide receiver at Penn State in recent years. We know how difficult it's been, and then even you look at Harrison Wallace, and impressed with what he did at Ole Miss with an offensive staff like that, down in Oxford, compared to what he did and didn't do, or what he wasn't able to do, with Marcus Hagans as wide receivers coach and the rest of the offensive staff at Penn State last year. It's a point of contention. It's always been a point of scrutiny, a subject of scrutiny, the wide receiver position over the last few years at Penn State. And Noah Pauley is a guy who can flip that on its head very quickly. You mentioned the story that I did with two really good conversations I had with Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, the star wide receivers from Iowa State in 2024. Stories on Matt Campbell, on Taylor Mauser, and his mindset, letting your what's hang, and then also a story on Noah Pauley. And what they told me about Noah Pauley is just like, these were two guys who came from different backgrounds. Where Jalen Noel was a very like an underrated, overlooked 3-star guy who came to Iowa State as really a shot in the dark, right? Or as a developmental guy who developed into an explosive playmaker. Jaden Higgins was a transfer from Eastern Kentucky, and
Mhm.
he had some solid offers out there, but it wasn't like he had Alabama and Ohio State after him. And Noah Pauley helped turn both of those guys into second and third round picks with the Texans, and both are playing well with the Texans, Higgins especially. And I just think what Noah Pauley can do from a developmental standpoint, from an elevation of play standpoint, I just think Penn State's offense needs that. They
Mhm.
certainly needed that over the last couple of years, and certainly, I'm very, very interested to see what Penn State's wide receivers look like, not just in 2026, but in 2027. What kind of receivers they go after, and then in
Mhm.
terms of guys who are still in the building who stayed, Kobe Howard being the biggest one of that bunch. Watching his development and seeing how he pans out as a player.
Yeah, Chase Soul is one that on the podcast on Monday with Bob Flounders, I talked about him as well. I think he's a dynamic wideout who's had some injury problems in the past, but another guy who transferred from East Carolina and it, lower rank to come up. I think he's a guy that could really explode for Penn State this year. And then Brett Skildsen came over too in the portal after leading Iowa State in receiving last year. I think that the floor of this receiving core is solid this year. I wonder if the ceiling is as high as you may want it to be. But when you give Noah Pauley and Matt Campbell a full offseason to recruit high school talent, to evaluate this roster where you're not just playing catch up to make sure you have enough bodies to go compete in the Big Ten, I'm very curious, and I think Noah Pauley will do a good job. Just to continue to round out the offensive staff before we move on to the defense, Ryan Clanton is one that I think a couple of times he's just like strikes me as down to earth football guy. Like, he's I think his profile pic, he's wearing shorts on the sideline. He's got a big beard. Pretty much the whole coaching staff was out at the Penn State men's hockey game last Friday night. He's out there slamming some beers, like there's like these guys are just like they get it, they're football guys. And Clanton won a national championship. Iowa State's also they had a lot of success when they had him running the run game over the past couple of years. Their offensive line play continually got better with him there. A guy who played at the highest level. I think it's a great hire. And then the other one is Taylor Mauser, who you talked about the LYNH motto. I'm not going to spell that one out, but you can figure it out. Uh, and so Taylor Mauser, when Matt Campbell was introduced at the hockey game last Friday, Taylor Mauser was off to kind of like the side of the shot, and he puts his finger up and he chugs what was left of his beer. And it's just like there's a lot of personality in this staff, and based on your conversation with Jaden Higgins and Jalen Knoll, like I think you're going to see that on the field. Like I think you're going to see that personality that it is blue collar, like a blue collar mentality under Matt Campbell's staff. And I think the offense you're going to see it. Like Mauser's going to run a lot of heavy personnel, a lot of tight ends. I mean, he is also the tight ends coach. There's a little bit of a different feel with this staff than what we had at Penn State before.
It's blue collar, but it's aggressive when it comes to Taylor Mauser in terms of not being afraid to take shots, not being afraid to push the envelope and push the ball, downfield. The numbers bear that out in terms of the percentage of throws, at or behind the line of scrimmage that Rocco Becht had over the last 2 years at Iowa State versus what Drew Aller had under Andy Kotelnicki over the last 2 years at Penn State. It's a pretty sizable difference. Again, if you want a fuller picture of who Taylor Mauser is, just go back and check out that story I wrote on him. I guess it was a few weeks back now after talking to Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel. But both of those guys loved his mentality. They loved his aggression. And also, just to add on that, Max, you mentioned the tight ends coach end of this. In terms of the staff departures, one that you would consider to be a real worry would be Ty Howell going to Virginia Tech to become the offensive coordinator. Understandable. But what Penn State has been able to do from a recruiting and development standpoint at that position, Taylor Mauser is one of those guys who can continue to do that. He had Charlie Kohler at Iowa State, who was a great player, and now with the Ravens, bringing in Benjamin Brahmer as well, and all Big 12. I keep wanting to say, when I write all Big 12 for these Iowa State transfers, wanted to say all Big 10 because I'm so
I
used
know,
to
me
it.
too.
It's
Yeah.
just the one little number there that I always have to backspace and change. But he's had success with tight ends as well, so
Yeah.
you would think that would continue at Penn State.
Yeah, and obviously Andrew Rappleyea coming back as well is huge.
Yes.
So really excited to see how that group plays out. Johnny, let's flip it to the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, we can start out with D'Anton Lynn, but we've talked about him a lot on this podcast over the past couple of weeks since he was hired. I think it's just a fantastic pickup. Like it's there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He took two defenses at UCLA and USC after a long career in the NFL, and he took terrible defenses and made them average defenses in his first year. Which, like, you don't say, "Oh, we're playing for average at Penn State." Well, in this situation, that was a really big deal. I mean, UCLA and USC were atrocious defensively before he took over, and then he came in and, like, they can go out and play, and that's a huge thing. He's going to have more talent at Penn State, more resources at Penn. Maybe not more resources than USC, but I think the resources dedicated to the defensive side of the ball may be a little bit different. And I'm very curious to see how it goes.
This is a guy that James Franklin wanted for a long time.
Yeah.
And he never joined Penn State, even though he is a Penn State letterman. And now he comes to Happy Valley, returns home, and he is every bit a riser in the coaching industry. He spent so much time in the NFL, which gets overlooked because a lot of people, when and I get it, when a coordinator is hired, the first thing you do is just go look at like the defense or offense that they coordinated and look at the points per game allowed or scored. And you just kind of look at a number and you judge off of that. With D'Anton Lynn, you can't do that. First of all, you have to recognize that this guy spent almost a decade as an assistant in the NFL, working as an assistant positions coach, whether it was quality control, those things. That experience is really big for a young coach to have that level of experience. Comes to college, and like we said, like the UCLA year he was there in 2023, very good. And then USC, it was a total dumpster fire, man. So total dumpster fire under Alex Grinch, the defensive coordinator that Lincoln Riley brought with him to USC, and to be able to make adjustments and make changes, make tangible changes. It's not going to blow you away. They're not top 5 in all these different categories, USC, over the last 2 years, but it was a notable improvement. And some of that is the different talent that they bring in and all that. But USC is never lacking for talent necessarily. It is lacking in commitment on the defensive side of the ball. I think it could be probably tough to be a defensive coordinator under Lincoln Riley, as the head coach, when everything is geared toward the offense, and historically speaking, his defenses haven't been all that great necessarily. So I think D'Anton did a really good job at both stops out in LA, and to get him back in State College. We've talked about the importance of having lettermen and having Penn State represented on the staff, and in terms of recruiting, in terms of alumni relations, and all of that stuff. And James Franklin took some of that with him. But to have on the offensive side of the ball, to have Trace McSorley still as the assistant quarterbacks coach, to have Terry Smith, who obviously garnered a lot of support from players, former players, fans throughout his interim run, to have D'Anton Lynn come to State College to be the defensive coordinator, then also to retain Dan Connor as the assistant linebackers coach. Like those are really big moves from Matt Campbell. So it's not going to feel like it's just, oh, this is just an Iowa State implant staff. Like there are Penn State, ties. There's guys who know, what makes kind of Penn State football in all the best ways. And I think that matters a lot.
Yeah. Johnny, for our audience, we had some technical difficulties that made us start a couple minutes late today. And we are unfortunately running close to our allotted time here this afternoon. But we're just to kind of go around the horn and finish up the defensive side of the ball here so that we don't miss anything. Deion Broomfield came over from Iowa State to coach safeties. He and Terry Smith have put together a very deep secondary for this season on the Penn State roster. I think that's going to be one of, if not the strongest position groups on the 2026 team. Tyson Vate comes over after a year as the defensive coordinator at Cincinnati. He was the linebackers coach for Matt Campbell in the past. Was named linebackers coach of the year a couple times. That's a big time hire. I mean, you're taking a guy out of a defensive coordinator role to come be an assistant. There's familiarity there. I think that's a big deal that we haven't necessarily hit on big enough yet, hit on hard enough yet. Like you said, Dan Connor remains the assistant linebackers coach, a guy who has garnered so much respect in just a couple of years at Penn State. Ikaika Malloy comes over from UCLA to coach the defensive line. He's brought some big bodies in the portal, some size that we haven't seen at Penn State in a while, and has some familiarity from his year with D'Anton Lynn at UCLA. And then also Christian Smith comes over to coach specifically the edge rushers after his time as the D-line coach at Northwestern, where he had a couple of defensive ends over the past few years that were solid. Aiden Hubbard and Anto Saka were two good defensive ends, productive players in the Big Ten on a mediocre team. I think that's an interesting hire that may go overlooked and shouldn't. I just think there's a lot of backgrounds on this defense. Smith also played for Matt Campbell. Like, there not only are some backgrounds and a lot of experience, but also familiarity with what Matt Campbell wants. Johnny, are there any names there that stick out to you a lot that you want to talk about? I mean, Terry Smith was a non-negotiable. We've talked about him at length over the past few months, but outside of him, who really catches your fancy?
I mean, I think you covered it, honestly. I mean, bringing over Smith as the edge rushers coach is really interesting to me because we know the history, especially the recent history of the edge rushers that Penn State has put in the NFL. Obviously, Abdul Carter comes to mind, but D'Anton Lynn, like, I'll be down at the Senior Bowl and I'll be seeing him down there. You always end up seeing like an Adisa Isaac and Adafe Owe, Arnold Ebiketie even coming in from the transfer portal. Obviously, Micah Parsons is Micah Parsons, but like, you always have that talent off the edge. If you're Penn State, Chop Robinson, like, the list goes on and on and on over the last, really, like, for a very, very long time. You can keep going back into the early to mid 2000s and even beyond that. But in terms of keeping the momentum going with what James Franklin and his staff had, with multiple defensive line coaches, whether it's Deion Barnes, John Scott, Sean Spencer, like, they've always put dudes in the NFL, coming off the edge and getting after the quarterback. And, I do like bringing over Smith from Northwestern. I think it's a good hire. And that's a spot that they have to continue to, progress and have guys like have real difference makers and have real game changers. Because you can have as solid of a defense as you want, but if you can't get after the quarterback, it's gonna be pretty easy for the best teams in college football to move the ball, especially when you're looking at the Ohio States and Oregons and Indianas now of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept of having a specific edge rushers coach is fairly rare in college football, I think, and I think it's an important position, like you said, to focus on. And I'm very curious how the experiment goes with Christian Smith in town. Just before we head out of here, I would be remiss to not mention that Justin Lustig also returns as the special teams coordinator. I don't really think that one has flown under the radar for Penn State fans. I think they realize, like, Penn State had a very consistent special teams group over the past 2 seasons with him there. You think about a couple of timely fake punt successes for Penn State. I mean, Ryan Barker has been one of the most consistent kickers in the country for 2 years. Gabe Wosu had a great year punting the ball. I think that's a big deal. I think it's potentially overlooked, but also I think people know that Penn State had a really strong special teams unit. I mean, they also blocked 5 kicks last year, kicks and punts combined. Denai Dennis Sutton had 3 of them. That's impressive stuff. And it's worth noting that he's back, which I think was a nice get for Matt Campbell. Johnny, we have one question that I want to hit on that just came up before we go from David Felty. I'll get it on the screen here. What's the opinion of strength and conditioning? Did losing Losi hurt us? The one thing I will say is losing Chuck Losi's mustache certainly hurts no matter what, because that thing is elite beyond elite. Look, Chuck was a good guy. I think he fit really well into what James Franklin wanted out of his coaching staff. Obviously, they had so much history together. It goes back to working with Dwight Galt as well. Like, I think that they were always on the same page, which you could take one of two ways. You could say, okay, that's great. The coaching staff or the strength staff and the coaching staff being on the same page means they're all working toward the same things. Or if you say, well, James Franklin wasn't getting the job done here and his development wasn't good enough, that does go back and reflect on how they're running the strength staff and the strength and conditioning in the summer. And that is Chuck Losi. I think he did a fine job. Like, I don't have any ill will against Chuck Losi. I think saying losing him is gonna hurt though. I don't know if you can say that necessarily, because every staff has kind of a different view of what they want. I have not had the chance to meet Reed Keggy yet. I don't know a lot about his background. He was at Iowa State with Matt Campbell for a long time. And again, the key is, are they on the same page? Do they want the same things? And we'll see how it works out from there.
Yeah, only thing to add on my front is every year, year in, year out at the NFL Combine, Penn State guys continually perform well, and that's something that even NFL scouts, executives, that's something that resonates throughout. It's just like Penn State strength and conditioning staff, whatever they're doing is working. So we'll find out. Really, this is something that in terms of is a strength and conditioning staff change. Is it a big deal? When it comes to developing players and athletes, like something that might not show up for another 3-4 years, honestly, especially in this case where you have a whole new staff coming in. So maybe we'll find out at the 2028 NFL Combine
Yeah.
if Penn State players are continually killing it, and if they're not, then maybe that's a poor reflection on what the staff is currently. So I think that's one we'll find out more in time.
Yeah, I'm with you absolutely. And that's going to do it for us here on this live edition of the Blue White Breakdown. I did also want to mention we had somebody say that they're one of the few people that has been a Penn State and Virginia Tech fan for over 30 years. You're either really happy that you still get James Franklin around, or you're not so happy about it. I don't know. That is quite a combination. I don't think you see it very often anywhere. But hope you enjoyed the show today with a little Virginia Tech talk as well mixed in there. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast. Make sure you subscribe to PennLive.com. Follow mine and Johnny's work, and Bob Flounders, of course, as always. And yeah, we're going to see you next week. Same time, same place, noon on Thursday. Peace.